and gentlemen again, I am not sure how much needs to be said about Vince Cable, as he has such a high profile already. The Telegraph recently described him as the government's most trenchant economic critic. Vince is a graduate of Cambridge and has a PhD from Glasgow, having worked both as an economist in both the private sector and the public sector. He became the MP for Twickenham in 1997 and has since risen rapidly through the ranks to his current position as the Liberal Democrat Shadow Chancellor. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Vince Cable.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you for inviting me to this remarkable occasion, extraordinarily distinguished guest list. I'm here for several reasons. The first is that Ben Thompson did a brilliant job of selling the event to me. The second, I've come here to support my Scottish Lib Dem colleagues, but for the rest of you, I can assure you I'm not going to give you a political rant. There probably will be a few bits of subliminal propaganda in what I have to say. But the third reason is it sort of reconnects me with my Scottish background. Not that I'm Scottish by origin, but I learned my politics here in a way that perhaps now seems a little strange. In my early 20s, I was part of what we fondly regarded as the Glasgow Mafia and running the city of Glasgow. And when I was reading the Scottish press this weekend about the shenanigans going on there, I realised that nothing very much had changed. And indeed, when I was there, I think I was a member of the Labour group. I think 4 of my colleagues were carted off to Barlinnie prison, and as I say, not a great deal has changed. But nonetheless, I did look back on that time as a remarkable education in the kind of university of life. And I look back on it, there were some good things, there were some bad things. I was reminded when I came through Edinburgh Airport today, and there was a picture on the front page of the newspaper of the block of flats where that tragedy occurred, in the block of flats in Springburn, that I have some collective responsibility for having put those flats up in the first place. But there were many good things too, and I have vivid recollections of some of the very fine people who were active in local government. I served with Sir William Gray on the Conservative side, people like Len Turpey, in Edinburgh at the same time, people like Robin Cook. And I think one of my great regrets is the way in which British local government on both sides of the border has been slowly confined, and the sense of civic engagement that we had has in many ways been snuffed out. And I certainly emerged from that experience a very passionate believer in devolution in the widest sense. Devolution to local government, and also devolution within Scotland. And I'm delighted that Scottish government has happened. I was, at the time, one of those heretics who opposed the rigid unionism of both major parties at that time and argued for a Scottish Parliament and Scottish government. Indeed, I would argue, as some of my colleagues do, that that process hasn't yet gone far enough. There is a very strong case for fiscal federalism of the kind which is enjoyed in the United States and Canada, and I think we should see it here. The other reason I'm indebted to Scotland is not just for my political education, but for my economic education. I was first of all educated in economics by the disciples of Keynes, who I thought was the world's greatest economist. And I came up here and I discovered the other one, Adam Smith, and indeed taught his ideas about trade to students. And I still get cross when I hear the memory of Adam Smith being appropriated by people who believe in unfettered laissez-faire. Because of course that wasn't what he was about. He was about liberty government and social responsibility and a very sophisticated view of the role of the state. So it's often said, and I think it was Keynes who said, that all practical men of affairs are slaves of some defunct economist. and I have two. One is Keynes and one is Adam Smith, one liberal with a small L, one liberal with a big L. So much of what I have to say tonight stems from that upbringing and outlook on life. But let me just turn to what I think you've come to hear me talk about, which is what I think is happening in the UK economy. And it isn't totally clear. There's a lot of fog surrounding it. I would start perhaps with a simple, perhaps rather hackneyed metaphor. But what I think has happened in the UK economy, and of course this isn't just the UK problem, but I'm focusing on that, is the economic equivalent of a massive heart attack. We're not just talking about a cyclical change, and we've had cycles over the post-war period. We're dealing with something much more fundamental, a massive shock centred on a collapse of the banking system. And it's done a lot of damage. Not actually as much damage as it might have done, but it's done a lot of damage, and it will continue to do so. And that damage is manifested in part in what's now happening in unemployment levels. Somebody mentioned before dinner that 60,000 jobs have been lost in the central belt of Scotland. It may well rise to 100,000. Unemployment is actually not at levels that you would have predicted given the scale of this crisis, but it's still high. And it's exceptionally high amongst young people, young graduates and school leavers. So there is a major social fallout from this economic crisis. But what is remarkable and strange in some ways about what's happened is that the patient, the victim of this heart attack, hasn't died. Still alive, still in intensive care. And the reason the patient is still alive is because of remarkable economic medicine. When you reflect on what's happened in the last 16, 18 months, things have been done or happened which we would never have dreamt were feasible in terms of economic policy. We've had interest rates cut to virtually zero. We've had the deliberate creation of money, which is essentially what quantitative easing involves, something we were aware of in the textbooks, and those people who had read their Milton Friedman understood what monetarism does in a crisis, but it had never been applied before, and it has been applied, and it's what's helping to keep the British economy alive. We've had enormous fiscal deficits of the kind that we just have referred to, 12-13% of GDP, levels unknown outside of wartime, an exceptional crisis. We've had the part nationalisation of the banking system, and we've also had a very substantial devaluation, which has largely passed unnoticed, but certainly for people who are engaged in international trade, exporting, competing with imports, and indeed inward investment, including takeovers, has had a massive impact on the way economic behaviour is manifesting itself. So we've had a massive shock, we've had a very powerful policy response, and, as I say, the patient is still alive, albeit in intensive care. And the question then is, well, where do we go from here? What I was taught when I was at Shell, I worked in planning, was their chief economist, and one of the things we were told was never to engage in simple single-line forecasting. Never do it. Indeed, the first day I took up my job, I was approached by the chairman of the managing directors and given a little tapestry that they gave to everybody who did that job, and it had an Arabic saying on it. And I asked for a translation, as I was obviously expected to do. And they said, well, what it means is that those who claim to be able to forecast the future are lying, even if by chance they're later proved right. And what we were taught to do was to think in terms of scenarios.